Dr. Mark Collins had never experienced a crash landing before. He'd seen plenty of action in his years as a medical officer on the Galactic Union ship Horizon, and during his career, he'd patched up more than his fair share of injured crewmates. Yet, all the training in the world couldn't have prepared him for the chaos that erupted mere moments after the alarms started blaring across the ship. They were nearing the edge of an uncharted system, conducting routine scans of the surrounding space. Everything had been going smoothly, and the crew was expecting to complete their surveys without incident. Then came the mysterious, sudden gravitational spike that caused all systems to malfunction. The ship careened out of control, plummeting toward the surface of a nearby planet. Mark barely had time to reach for his emergency seat restraints before the Horizon collided with the planet's atmosphere, shaking violently, and hurling objects across the room. The next thing he remembered was the impact. An overwhelming, bone-rattling explosion of sound and force, then silence. Nothing but silence. When Mark awoke, he found himself lying on his back, staring up at a sky unlike any he had ever seen. It was a deep crimson, tinged with swirling violet clouds, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. He blinked a few times, trying to gather his bearings. His head pounded, and his vision swam with spots, but he forced himself to sit up. Around him, debris from the ship was scattered across the ground, shattered fragments of metal and glass, twisted beyond recognition. Groaning, he touched the side of his head and winced as his fingers came away wet with blood. Nothing serious, he determined, but it would require attention. He could worry about himself later. First, he needed to assess the situation. Mark's wrist scanner, an all-purpose medical tool, was still functioning. He activated it, its soft hum a welcome sound of normalcy amid the chaos. The scanner detected only one other life sign in the immediate area: Zara, the Zelnathian biologist who had been part of their crew. Her vitals were weak but stable. He quickly made his way toward her signal, navigating the wreckage carefully. Zara lay pinned beneath a heavy piece of debris. Her silver skin, which shimmered faintly in the alien light, looked dull, and her eyes were closed. Mark felt a knot of dread form in his stomach. Zelnathians were a proud race, known for their resilience and keen intellect, but right now, she looked as fragile as any human. Zara. Mark called her name urgently as he knelt beside her. He reached out, checking her pulse and ensuring she was still breathing. Her arm was trapped beneath a large metal beam from the ship, and her breathing was shallow. It was a miracle she had survived the crash at all. He scanned her injuries quickly: several fractured bones, some internal bleeding, and a possible concussion. Time was not on their side. Zara's alien physiology made things more complicated, but Mark had been trained to handle all sorts of interspecies medical emergencies. He had to stabilize her quickly if they were to have any hope of survival. "Stay with me, Zara," Mark muttered as he activated the small emergency medical kit he always kept on his belt. The device hummed to life, and he pressed it against her side, where his scanner indicated the internal bleeding was most severe. The healing field would help repair the damaged tissue, but she needed to be fully treated in a medbay, something they no longer had. With a deep breath, Mark gathered his strength and pushed the metal beam off her arm. The effort left him winded, but the relief on Zara's face as the pressure lifted was worth it. Her eyes fluttered open, and she winced in pain. "Where are we?" she rasped, her voice weak. "We crashed," Mark said simply, wiping the sweat from his brow. "The ship's gone. It's just us." Zara's glowing blue eyes widened slightly as she took in their surroundings, her expression hard to read. Zelnathians were not known for showing emotions outwardly, especially under duress, but Mark could see the tension in her jaw and the tightness around her eyes. She tried to sit up but winced, clutching her injured arm. "I can't feel my arm," she muttered. Mark helped her sit up carefully, supporting her as he quickly scanned her arm. "Your nerves are damaged, but I can repair them once we get to safety. Right now, we need to find shelter and figure out where we are." Zara nodded, though her usual composed demeanor was slipping as the reality of their situation sank in. "Did anyone else survive?" Mark shook his head. "Not that I can tell. We're the only ones here." For a moment, the only sound was the faint, ominous hum of the alien wind sweeping across the barren landscape. Mark took a deep breath, trying to push down the rising sense of dread. He was trained for emergencies, but being stranded on an unknown planet with no communication and no way of knowing what dangers lay ahead was something else entirely. Zara shifted uncomfortably, her gaze sweeping the horizon. This planet. It wasn't on any of our charts. Mark nodded. I know. Whatever caused the crash wasn't natural. We got pulled in, almost like some kind of gravitational trap. Zara's expression darkened. We need to move. If there's anything intelligent on this planet, they might not be friendly. Mark glanced around. The landscape was desolate, nothing but red sand and jagged rocks as far as the eye could see. There was no sign of life, intelligent or otherwise, but that didn't mean they were alone. The planet's atmosphere was breathable, though thin, but they had no idea how long it would be before their supplies ran out or if the local environment would turn hostile. Zara tried to stand but nearly collapsed again, her injuries worse than they appeared. Mark caught her just in time, his grip steady as he helped her balance. Easy, he said softly, you're still too weak. She gritted her teeth, frustration evident in her voice. We can't stay here. Mark looked around at the wreckage, knowing she was right. The debris from the ship would be a beacon to anything nearby, and they had no way of knowing whether or not it was dangerous. They had to find shelter, something to shield them from the elements and, potentially, hostile life forms. His wrist scanner pinged softly, and Mark glanced at the small display. There was a faint signal, barely detectable, but it was enough to give him hope. I'm picking up some kind of structure not too far from here. It's faint, but it could be an old settlement or even a natural cave system. Zara's eyes lit up, the faintest flicker of determination in her gaze. Then we go. Mark helped her to her feet, and the two of them began the long trek across the red sands. The landscape was harsh, the air dry and cold. The ground beneath their feet was jagged and uneven, making every step a challenge. Mark's medical training kept his mind focused on Zara's condition, ensuring she didn't push herself too hard. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As they walked, the sky darkened, the swirling violet clouds above seeming to pulse with an unnatural energy. The planet was eerily silent, no sounds of animals or wind, just the crunch of their boots on the sand. Mark's nerves were on edge. They were vulnerable, injured, and completely cut off from any form of communication. But they had no choice. The structure ahead, whatever it was, might be their only hope. Chapter 2, The Silent Observers. The trek across the desolate, alien landscape was more taxing than Mark had anticipated. The thin atmosphere made every breath a laborious effort, and the jagged, uneven terrain felt relentless under their feet. His heart hammered in his chest from exertion, but he pressed forward, knowing they couldn't afford to stop. Beside him, Zara moved with silent determination, though her injuries were clearly taking a toll. Mark glanced over at her, her silver skin catching the faint light from the swirling sky above. Zelnathians had a reputation for being tough and resilient, but even Zara's stoicism couldn't mask the pain she was feeling. Her arm hung limply at her side, and though she tried to hide it, Mark could see the tightness in her jaw every time she took a step. How's the arm? He asked, keeping his voice low. Zara didn't meet his gaze. Functional. I'll survive. Mark sighed inwardly. He wasn't going to push her, Zara wasn't the type to admit vulnerability easily. They both knew her condition was far from ideal, but for now, survival was their primary focus. The signal Mark had detected earlier grew stronger as they pressed on, leading them toward what appeared to be a rocky outcrop in the distance. The barren red sands stretched endlessly in every direction, the sky above casting an unnatural light that seemed to flicker with each step they took. It was eerie, how silent the planet was, no wind, no sound of wildlife. Just the oppressive silence and the rhythmic crunch of their boots. Mark's wrist scanner pulsed again, the signal growing more distinct. We're getting closer, he said, breaking the silence. Zara nodded, though her expression remained impassive. She was conserving her energy, Mark realized, and wisely so. They had no idea how long they would need to keep moving or what might be waiting for them. As they neared the outcrop, Mark's scanner beeped with renewed intensity. There was definitely something here, something emitting a low-level energy signature. But what? An old settlement? A natural cave system? The signal was too faint to make out the specifics. When they reached the base of the rocky outcrop, Mark paused, scanning the area carefully. The outcrop rose sharply from the ground, jagged cliffs of reddish stone towering above them. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a natural formation, but as he moved closer, Mark noticed something strange. There, partially hidden by layers of sand and rock, was a doorway, rectangular and clearly artificial. Zara, now standing beside him, narrowed her glowing blue eyes at the sight. This is not natural. No, Mark agreed, running his hand over the smooth edges of the doorway. It was clearly ancient, worn down by time and the elements, but undeniably crafted by intelligent hands. Zara stepped forward, inspecting the doorway with a critical eye. It looks like it's been abandoned for a long time. But the structure is still intact. Mark's wrist scanner beeped again, this time detecting faint traces of power deep within the structure. There's some kind of energy source inside. It's weak, but it's there. Zara hesitated for a moment before nodding. Then we go inside. It's our best option. With a bit of effort, they managed to pry the door open, the old mechanism grinding as it gave way. Beyond the entrance, a dark tunnel stretched into the depths of the rock. The air inside was cooler than the scorching heat of the desert outside, though stale and tinged with an unfamiliar metallic scent. Mark activated the small light on his wrist scanner, illuminating the narrow tunnel ahead. "Stay close," he said softly, leading the way inside. The tunnel walls were smooth, clearly carved with purpose. Strange symbols, worn away by time, adorned the walls, their meaning long lost to the ages. Mark felt a chill creep down his spine as they ventured deeper into the structure. It wasn't just the cool air or the oppressive silence that made him uneasy, there was something else. A sense of being watched, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Zara seemed to sense it too. She moved quietly behind him, her keen eyes scanning the shadows. "We are not alone here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark stopped, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" Zara pointed to the walls. "These symbols. They are not just decorative. They are warnings." Mark's brow furrowed as he examined the symbols more closely. He wasn't well versed in ancient languages, but now that she mentioned it, the symbols did have a certain pattern to them, a repetitive design that suggested caution or danger. "What kind of warnings?" he asked. Zara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved ahead, her eyes narrowing as she studied the symbols further. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice laced with tension. "But whatever built this place, it didn't intend for it to be found." Mark's wrist scanner pinged again, the energy signature growing stronger the further they ventured. "There's definitely something powering this place," he said. "Maybe we can use it to send out a distress signal." Zara didn't respond, her focus still on their surroundings. Mark could see the unease in her posture, the way her body tensed with every step. It wasn't like her to show fear or hesitation, but whatever was down here, it was unnerving even for someone as controlled as Zara. They walked in silence for several minutes, the tunnel twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible to tell how far they had gone. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Mark's instincts were screaming at him to turn back, but they had no choice. If they didn't find shelter, and soon they wouldn't survive much longer. Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel. Before them stood a large, circular chamber, dimly lit by faint, flickering lights embedded in the walls. The floor was littered with dust and debris, but in the center of the room stood a strange, obelisk-like structure. It was made of a dark, metallic material that seemed to hum with energy, though the power was clearly waning. Mark approached the obelisk cautiously, his scanner beeping rapidly. This must be the source of the energy. Zara stayed back, her gaze fixed on the obelisk with suspicion. "Be careful, Doctor. We do not know what we are dealing with." Mark nodded, but his curiosity got the better of him. He reached out, placing his hand on the surface of the obelisk. The metal was cold to the touch, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the obelisk emitted a soft, pulsing light, and the chamber filled with a low, resonant hum. Zara stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the small weapon she carried on her belt. "What did you do?" "I don't know," Mark replied, stepping back as the hum grew louder. Before they could react, the walls around them began to shift. Panels slid open, revealing hidden alcoves, and from within those alcoves, shadowy figures began to emerge. They were humanoid in shape, but their features were obscured by the darkness. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and unnervingly precise. Mark's heart raced as the figures stepped into the light, revealing their true forms. They were tall, slender, and covered in a smooth, glossy exoskeleton. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, were large and reflective, and they moved with an eerie grace. Zara's grip tightened on her weapon, her posture tense. "We need to leave. Now." Mark didn't argue. He grabbed Zara's arm, pulling her toward the exit as the strange creatures began to move closer. The low hum of the obelisk grew louder, almost deafening, as if it were reacting to their presence. But just as they reached the tunnel entrance, the ground beneath them trembled. The walls began to shift again, and a massive stone door slammed shut, blocking their escape. They were trapped. Chapter 3: Unlikely Allies. The deep, resonating thud of the stone door echoed through the chamber, sealing Mark and Zara inside with the towering constructs. Mark's pulse raced as he scanned the room, heart hammering in his chest. The construct's tall, humanoid figures encased in gleaming, metallic exoskeletons stood as silent sentinels, their reflective eyes tracking every move he and Zara made. Each one was at least 7 feet tall, with long, powerful limbs and an aura of cold precision. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, the hum of the obelisk at the center of the room the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Mark's throat felt tight as he moved closer to Zara, keeping his eyes fixed on the constructs. What the hell are these things? Zara, always composed, studied the towering figures with a keen eye. Automatons. Likely defense systems for this facility. Defense systems? Mark's voice was low, his hand instinctively moving toward the plasma pistol at his side. They don't look like they're just standing around for show. Zara nodded slowly. They've been activated by your interaction with the obelisk. It seems we triggered them by entering this chamber. They're designed to protect something. Protect what? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper as his gaze darted between the constructs, which remained eerily still, though their posture exuded a readiness for action. I don't know yet, Zara replied. Her glowing blue eyes were fixed on the obelisk, a dark, towering monolith that pulsed with faint energy. She stepped closer to it, cautiously. But this obelisk is the key. It controls the constructs. Mark swallowed hard, his fingers twitching near his pistol. He had never been one for violence, but the presence of these silent, mechanical guardians unnerved him deeply. Can you turn them off? Zara's fingers traced the intricate symbols carved into the obelisk's surface, her expression thoughtful. The obelisk is old, very old. It's not just a control device, it's part of the power grid that runs through the entire facility. If I disable it, I might destabilize everything. Mark's stomach sank. So, we can't just turn them off. Not without risking a complete collapse of the structure, Zara said, glancing briefly at him before turning back to the obelisk. But there may be another way. Mark watched as she studied the obelisk, her hands moving methodically over the ancient control panel. The symbols were alien, indecipherable to him, but Zara seemed to be piecing something together, her sharp mind working quickly. There's a chance I can reroute the power, she said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. If I can isolate the construct's energy source, I can deactivate them without disrupting the rest of the system. Mark exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. And if you can't? Zara's eyes remained on the obelisk. Then the facility collapses. Or the constructs attack. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The constructs remained still, but their presence loomed large, like a sword hanging over his head. Their exoskeletons were smooth and impenetrable, and Mark had no doubt that they could dismantle him and Zara in moments if given the chance. "We don't have much time," Zara said, her tone crisp as she continued to work. "I need you to watch them." Mark nodded, his mouth dry. He positioned himself so he had a better view of the constructs, his pulse quickening with every passing second. They remained still for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for the right moment to act. Zara's fingers flew across the obelisk's control panel, her mind clearly focused on deciphering the ancient technology. The symbols glowed faintly under her touch, pulsing in time with the hum of the obelisk's energy. Mark glanced nervously at the constructs again, his grip tightening on his plasma pistol. Minutes ticked by in agonizing silence, the tension in the air growing thicker. Mark could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door behind them was sealed, and the constructs blocked any other possible escape routes. Finally, Zara spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I found the primary energy node. I'm going to reroute the power now." Mark's pulse quickened as he watched her fingers move deftly over the controls. The hum of the obelisk grew louder, the symbols glowing brighter as the energy within the device surged. Mark's eyes darted toward the constructs, half expecting them to spring to life at any moment. Suddenly, one of the constructs shifted. Its head tilted slightly, its reflective eyes locking onto Zara with unsettling focus. Mark's heart leapt into his throat, his hand flying to his pistol. "Zara," he said softly, his voice trembling. "They're moving." "I know," she replied, her voice calm despite the tension. "Just give me a few more seconds." Mark's fingers hovered over the trigger of his pistol, his heart racing as the construct took a slow, deliberate step forward. Its movements were mechanical but fluid, its tall frame casting a long shadow across the chamber floor. Mark could hear the soft whir of servos as the construct moved, its reflective eyes glinting in the dim light. "Hurry," Mark urged, his voice tight with fear. Zara's fingers moved faster, her brow furrowed in concentration. The hum of the obelisk grew louder still, and the glow from the symbols intensified, casting an eerie light across the chamber. Just as the construct took another step forward, Zara pressed a final sequence on the control panel. The hum of the obelisk shifted, and the light from the symbols dimmed. A sudden, sharp pulse of energy radiated from the obelisk, and the construct froze in place, its body rigid. Mark watched, holding his breath as the other constructs followed suit. One by one, they powered down, their reflective eyes dimming until they stood motionless, like statues once more. "You did it," Mark breathed, lowering his pistol. Relief flooded through him, though his hands still trembled from the adrenaline. Zara stepped back from the obelisk, her expression serious. "For now. But the power grid is unstable. They could reactivate at any moment if the system resets." Mark exhaled slowly, the tension still hanging over him like a heavy cloud. "Then we need to get out of here. Now." Zara nodded. "There's a passageway behind the obelisk. It should lead us deeper into the facility, hopefully toward an exit." Mark hesitated, his stomach twisting at the thought of venturing deeper into the facility. "Do we really want to go further in? What if there's something worse down there?" Zara's expression was unreadable as she looked at him. "We don't have a choice. The door we came through is sealed, and the constructs could reactivate at any moment. We need to find the control center for this facility, only then can we shut everything down." Mark felt a pit form in his stomach, but he knew she was right. They couldn't stay here. With a final glance at the deactivated constructs, Mark followed Zara toward the passageway behind the obelisk. The narrow tunnel stretched out before them, its walls lined with more of the strange, glowing symbols. The air was cooler here, and the hum of the facility's energy systems echoed faintly through the stone. They moved quickly but cautiously, the oppressive silence weighing down on them with every step. The passageway twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the bowels of the facility. Mark's wrist scanner beeped softly as it picked up faint energy signatures, though they were weak and erratic. "This place is ancient," Zara murmured, her eyes scanning the walls as they walked. "Older than anything I've ever seen." Mark nodded, though he felt a growing sense of unease. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the very walls were closing in on them, the darkness pressing down like a tangible force. After what felt like hours, the passageway opened up into another chamber, this one larger and more imposing than the last. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, and at the center of the room stood a massive, circular platform made of dark, polished metal. The air hummed with energy, and faint, glowing lines of power ran through the floor and walls, converging on the platform. Zara's eyes widened as she took in the sight. This is it. The teleportation platform. Mark's heart skipped a beat. A teleportation platform? Can it get us out of here? Zara moved closer to the platform, her fingers running over the control panel at its base. It's possible. But the power source is nearly depleted. We'll need to divert all remaining energy to the platform if we want to activate it. Mark's stomach clenched. And if we don't? Zara looked up at him, her expression grim. Then we're trapped here. Mark swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. They had come too far to turn back now. Do it. Chapter 4, Escape or Peril. The moment Mark stepped onto the teleportation platform, everything around him became a blur. The rumbling of the collapsing facility, the cracks splintering through the ancient walls, and the disorienting light from the platform all blended into a kaleidoscope of chaos. For a split second, Mark's vision filled with brilliant white light, and his stomach lurched as though he were falling. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the sensation ceased. He gasped, his knees buckling as he stumbled forward, struggling to regain his bearings. The air around him was no longer heavy and cold. Instead, it felt warm, almost pleasant, and carried a faint breeze. Slowly, Mark opened his eyes and found himself standing in a vast, open desert, the ground beneath his feet soft and sandy. Above him stretched a sky of deep orange, dotted with violet clouds. The oppressive atmosphere of the facility had been replaced with something far more serene but no less alien. Beside him, Zara dropped to one knee, her breathing labored but controlled. Her silver skin glistened in the strange light, and despite the fatigue and tension, her eyes remained sharp. Zara, are you all right? Mark asked, stepping toward her. She nodded, pushing herself up to stand. I am functional, she replied. But the facility. Mark turned to look behind them, half expecting to see the crumbling remnants of the alien structure they had just escaped from. But there was nothing. No sign of the facility, no indication that they had been inside a labyrinth of ancient technology only moments ago. It was as if the teleportation had dropped them into an entirely different world. Zara straightened herself and glanced around the landscape, her gaze analytical. This is not the same location we started in. The teleportation system must have transported us to another part of the planet. Mark took a deep breath, scanning their surroundings. The terrain stretched for miles in every direction, an endless expanse of red dunes and jagged rock formations. There was no sign of life, no vegetation, no animals, not even the remnants of the constructs they had encountered inside the facility. It was as if they had been dropped into a desert wasteland with no way to know where they were or how far from safety. We need to figure out where we are, Mark said, wiping sweat from his brow. The heat was becoming oppressive, the dry air sapping his energy. Do you still have any readings from your equipment? Zara checked her wrist scanner, her fingers moving quickly over the interface. She frowned. The interference from the teleportation has disrupted my scans. I'll need time for the system to recalibrate. Mark's heart sank. They were stranded in the middle of an alien desert, with no clear direction and no way of knowing how far they were from their ship if they could even make contact again. The odds of rescue seemed impossibly slim. Zara, as ever, remained composed. We must move. Staying here will only expose us to the elements. Which way? Mark asked, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. He had been running on adrenaline for hours now, and the heat of the desert was only making things worse. Zara scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowing as she studied the distant rock formations. We head toward higher ground, she said, pointing to a ridge that rose in the distance. From there, we can get a better view of the terrain and possibly locate a point of reference. Mark nodded. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than standing still. Together, they began their trek toward the ridge, the sand shifting beneath their feet as they climbed over the dunes. The sun, or what passed for a sun on this planet, beat down on them relentlessly, its light harsh and unforgiving. As they walked, Mark couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of unease. The desert seemed too quiet, too still. There was no wind, no sound other than the crunch of their boots in the sand. It reminded him of the eerie silence inside the facility, and that thought made him uneasy. "Do you think something else is out here?" Mark asked, glancing at Zara. Zara didn't respond immediately, her eyes focused on the path ahead. "It is possible," she said after a moment. "The facility we encountered was ancient, but it was built for a purpose. Whatever it was guarding may still be out here." Mark felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat. He had no desire to encounter whatever ancient threat had been contained in that facility, but the thought that it might still be lurking somewhere on the planet made their situation even more precarious. They climbed higher, the ridge looming closer as they pushed through the endless dunes. Mark's legs ached, and his throat was parched, but he forced himself to keep going. Every few minutes, he glanced at Zara, marveling at her endurance. Despite her injuries and the harsh conditions, she never faltered, her movements efficient and precise. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the top of the ridge. Mark collapsed onto the rocky ground, breathing heavily as he looked out over the landscape. From this vantage point, the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. But something caught his eye, a dark shape on the horizon, barely visible against the red sands. "What's that?" Mark asked, pointing toward the shape. Zara stood beside him, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the distant object. "It appears to be a structure," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Perhaps another part of the facility. Or a settlement." Mark felt a flicker of hope. If it was a settlement, they might be able to find shelter or even help. "We should head there." Zara nodded. "Agreed. But we must be cautious. We do not know who or what inhabits this planet." They descended the ridge, their pace quickening as they made their way toward the distant structure. As they walked, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a subtle, creeping sensation, like a presence just beyond the edge of his awareness. He glanced around nervously, but the desert remained empty and silent. "Do you feel that?" Mark asked, his voice low. Zara's gaze flickered toward him, her expression unreadable. "I do," she said softly. "We are not alone." Mark's pulse quickened. "What do you think it is?" Zara didn't answer immediately, her focus returning to the path ahead. "I do not know," she said finally. "But whatever it is, it has been observing us for some time." Mark swallowed hard, a sense of dread settling in the pit of his stomach. He had known, deep down, that escaping the facility hadn't meant they were out of danger. Whatever force had built that ancient structure and whatever it had been meant to contain was still present, lurking in the shadows of this strange planet. They pressed on, the structure in the distance growing larger with each step. As they drew closer, Mark realized it wasn't just a simple building. It was massive, a sprawling complex of towers and domes, half buried in the shifting sands of the desert. The architecture was unlike anything he had ever seen, ancient yet strangely advanced, its dark, angular shapes casting long shadows over the dunes. Zara stopped, her gaze fixed on the entrance to the complex. "This place, it is older than the facility we left behind." Mark felt a chill. "Older? How old?" Zara's expression remained unreadable. "Older than our species. Older than any known civilization in the galaxy." Mark stared at the looming structure, his heart pounding in his chest. They had escaped one ancient trap, only to stumble into another. "Do we go inside?" Zara hesitated for the first time, her eyes narrowing as she considered the question. "We have no choice," she said finally. "We need shelter. And answers." Mark nodded, though his stomach churned with fear. They had come too far to turn back now. Together, they approached the entrance to the ancient complex, the sense of being watched growing stronger with each step. As they crossed the threshold, the air inside the structure felt cool and thick with age. Shadows clung to the walls, and the faint hum of unseen machinery filled the silence. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Whatever secrets this place held, they were about to uncover them whether they wanted to or not.